Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Again, I know this is not what you wanted to do this evening, but I appreciate you are here. My name is Lior Samfiru. I'm an employment lawyer. I'm a partner and co-founder of Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. We're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, employee side firm in Canada. We operate in Ontario, in BC, and in Alberta. And I'm here to talk to you about what we all are concerned about, what you're concerned about, which is vaccinations and your employer's rights, their obligations, your rights, and what you can do about facing these mandates. So this is an important session. And just so you know, if you don't get to see the whole session, or if you want to tell others about it, we're going to be posting this session online later this week on the website that we have, which is called covidrights.ca. Again, covidrights.ca. And you can see it there. It's going to be there for everyone to view. So I'm going to get started now. I know you have questions. I've been getting questions. I've been speaking with people for weeks now, multiple times a day. So I know the questions that you have. So bear with me. I'm going to cover some important points today. I promise you that 90% of the questions that you have will be answered. I'm going to cover it. I know exactly what you want to know. I know what you're concerned about. I know the situations you're facing. So we'll talk about that. Now, a couple of things I want to make clear right off the bat. First thing is that this session is not about whether vaccines are good or bad. It's not about whether or not we support them or not. It's about employment law. Employment law, legal rights have nothing to do with my views, your views. It's simply the law. So this session really is very clear-cut about legal rights. Some of the things you may like, some of the things you may not like. Ultimately, that is the law. The other thing I want to talk about is the fact that pretty much everything we discussed today only applies to non-union employees, to non-unionized workplaces. And the reason for that is when it comes to a unionized workplace, the only one that's allowed to help you or to advise you is the union. And I know a lot of you say, well, the union is not helping me. Even still, despite that, the only ones allowed to help you is your union. There's nothing that you can do in that situation where you're unionized apart from your union. So I know it's not what you want to hear. I know it's difficult to accept, but there's nothing can be done really in that situation. The law essentially takes a back seat in a unionized workplace and tells the union, you figure it out. So because of that, anything that we discussed today really only applies to non-union employees. And there's nothing, I know a lot of you have questions, what about this or what about that? In a unionized environment, there's not going to be any exceptions. It's your union helps you. If the union doesn't, you may be able to file a complaint against the union with the labor board, but that's really it. Now, I'm going to be talking about some very important things. I'm going to cover about mandatory vaccines. Can your employer make you get vaccinated? COVID tests, mandatory tests. Can the employer make you do that? What happens if you're suspended? What happens if you were let go? Can that happen? I'll talk about how do you calculate your severance. I'll talk about all those important things today. So let's get started with that. Now, one of the things that people always ask me is my employer allowed to do something? I want you not to think in terms of what is your employer allowed to do. I want you to think in terms of what can you do if your employer does something? Because ultimately, you cannot prevent your employer from doing something. You cannot physically prevent or restrain your employer from doing something. The question is, if and when they do it, what can you do about it? What are your rights and your options? So there's really no point wondering, is this legal? The point is, okay, it's happened. Now what do we do? I'm going to talk about that. So the real issue is not whether it's legal. The real issue is, do you have any recourse? So that is going to be the focus of this session today. So the main question, the one that everyone wants to know is, can my employer mandate vaccines? Can my employer make me get a vaccine or punish me, let me go if I don't get a vaccine? So to analyze the question, we have to start with, first of all, is there a government mandate that applies to you? For example, in BC, the BC government has announced a mandate that applies in healthcare and long-term care. So in those situations, if you don't get vaccinated, your employer is allowed to put you off work because the employer doesn't have a choice. It's not their decision, it's the government's decision. So if there's a mandate like the one in BC in healthcare, yes, your employer can punish you, if you will, if you don't get vaccinated. In Ontario, we do have a mandate that applies to healthcare, but it's not for vaccines. It's only for tests. You can refuse to get a vaccine, but you have to get regular COVID tests. There will be potentially a mandate that applies to those employees that work for the federal government, and in transportation. But those are really the only mandates. And beyond that, okay, most employees are not covered. There's no mandate. So if you are covered by a mandate, very small number of people, your employer can let you go or suspend you with no compensation, again, because it's not their choice. It's not their decision. But here's what happens if there is no mandate. If there is no mandate, but your employer decides, you know what, we don't care about a mandate. We've decided ourselves that we want you to be vaccinated or else. So if you are not going to be vaccinated and you are let go, you certainly are going to be owed severance. That's kind of an easy thing. You're going to be owed severance. We'll talk in a second about how we calculate that. Severance could be as much as 24 months pay. Now, I know a lot of employers are saying, no, that's going to be just cause. We're not going to pay you severance because we feel we have just cause to let you go. No, that's not going to be just cause. They'll have to pay severance. Now, we may have to get involved and make that happen, but your employer is going to have to pay severance. So if you lose your job in a non-mandate situation because you didn't get vaccinated, you're owed severance. Keep in mind, you can't stop your employer from letting you go. Your employer will let you go. You can't stop that. Now, in addition to that severance, potentially you also could be owed human rights damages. Arguably, a mandatory vaccine policy when there's no mandate could be a human rights violation. It's considered or could be considered discrimination based on perceived disability. And on that basis, you could be owed human rights damages as well. So bottom line is, even though, yeah, it could be illegal to punish someone that doesn't get vaccinated, it's going to happen. There is absolutely no way to stop that, to physically stop that. You can show your employer the law and make them stop it. That's not going to happen. Ultimately, if your employer is going to do it, they're going to do it, but severance and other damages may be owed. So you do have to decide ultimately what is better. Are you better to lose your job and continue working? Sorry, are you better to get the vaccine and continue working? Sorry, that's what I meant to say. Or would you rather not get the vaccine, lose your job, and then deal with the compensation that you are owed? So that's where the focus has to be, because a lot of people say, well, that's illegal, so they can't do that. Well, it may be illegal, but the way the law works, the law doesn't stop them from doing it. The law simply deals with the consequences of actually doing it. So let's remember that. Now, a lot of employers are saying, okay, no, we're not going to let you go. We're going to put you on a leave of absence, an unpaid leave of absence. So let's talk a bit about that. Can your employer do that? Again, we're talking about where there's no government mandate that obligates your employer to do it. Well, if there's no government mandate, even an unpaid leave of absence is not something your employer is allowed to do. An unpaid leave of absence would be considered a constructive dismissal. In other words, it's a significant change to the terms of your employment, which gives you the right to say, aha, by putting me on this unpaid leave of absence, it's as if you've terminated my employment. Now, you don't have to do that. You can obviously accept the leave of absence, but the other option is you can say, by putting me on this leave of absence, you've terminated my employment. Now you have to pay me my full severance. So, and again, potentially other damages as well. So that's what happens with an unpaid leave of absence. Again, you can't necessarily stop that, but those are your rights. That is your right if your employer puts you on that leave of absence. Again, you have to decide, is it good to do that? Would I rather just stay on this leave of absence and hope things take care of themselves? Or would I rather say, no, I want to get my compensation? Now, the other thing to remember, if you're let go or put on a leave of absence, potentially, if you just don't do anything, you're not going to get EI. So that's why it makes sense to deal with your employer and get you severance, because we can also get you a new record of employment, and we can also then get you EI. If you stay on the leave of absence or your employer lets you go and you don't do anything, no severance and no EI. That's why we have to deal with it. If you are let go, if you are suspended, if you want to get your severance, connect with me. And by the way, to connect with me, you can go to covidrights.ca. You can also go to employmentlawyer.ca. Again, those joining us, my name is Lior Samfiru. I'm a co-founding partner of Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. Practice employment law, it's all I do, and I'm doing this session to talk to you about your rights now with respect to mandatory vaccines. So I just covered what happens with mandatory COVID tests, what your rights are. Remember I know I'm repeating myself, but this is probably to me the most important point. You can't stop it. There's no law that restrains your employer from doing something. But there is absolutely laws that would obligate your employer to pay you severance up to 2 years pay. We'll talk about how you calculate your severance now in a few minutes, and potentially other damages as well. All right. Now let's switch gear from mandatory COVID tests to mandatory COVID vaccines to mandatory COVID tests. So a lot of employers are saying, okay, fine, you don't have to get a vaccine, but if you want to continue working, you have to get regular COVID tests. So can they make you get regular COVID tests? So first of all, is there a mandate? Let's go back to the analysis. Is there a mandate? For example, in Ontario, in long-term care and healthcare, there's a mandate that says if you're not vaccinated, you have to have regular COVID tests. In that situation, if you refuse to have the tests, your employer doesn't have the option to keep you employed, so you can be let go or suspended potentially. That's if there is a mandate. Again, for most employees, most of you, there isn't. There is no mandate. So let's talk a bit about that situation. First of all, okay, actually, because I know I'm asked this often. In terms of mandates, if there is a mandate, your employer should be paying for the COVID tests. Why? If they don't, and they impose that cost on you, again, that could be a constructive dismissal. You say, well, wait a second, by making me incur this financial liability, it's as if, well, you've changed the terms of employment, I can consider that a termination. So in many cases, if you have to have regular COVID tests and you have to pay for them, again, depending how often you have to do it and the cost, that could be a constructive dismissal. If it's $200 a year, no, that's not going to be a constructive dismissal. If it's $200 a week, yeah, you better believe it's a constructive dismissal. Now, if there is no government mandate, generally speaking, if you lose your job or are suspended because you refuse to get regular COVID tests, you're still going to be owed severance. You're going to be owed your full severance in that situation. Even if it's not about vaccines, it's about COVID tests. Now, in that situation, you won't be owed any human rights damages, but you will be owed your full severance. That's true if you lose your job or if you're suspended. Again, that's a constructive dismissal. The only time you would not be owed severance is if you're in a workplace that has struggled with COVID-19 outbreaks, where masking and social distancing has not worked. They have to try something else. So they say, well, we have to, because clearly nothing is working for us. We keep having outbreak after outbreak. In that situation, your employer is going to be reasonable to say, we have to impose COVID tests because otherwise our business can't operate. That's going to be very, very rare. If your business has operated successfully without a bunch of people getting sick over the last year and a half, they're not going to be able to use that as a reason to impose mandatory COVID tests. Therefore, if you don't get a COVID test, again, can't stop that. You can't stop your employer from sending you that letter saying, if you don't get a regular COVID test, you're out of here. But if they do that and you decide not to do that, you will be owed severance in most cases. Again, having to decide what's better. Am I better to agree to get regular COVID tests and continue working? Or am I better off not to have COVID tests and lose my job or be suspended and get my severance? That is a personal decision. If you choose to pursue the severance, if you're off work, suspended, let go, connect with me, okay? Connect with my team. We've already been helping many people across Canada get their severance in exactly this situation. And again, to connect with me, with my team, covidrights.ca. Let's switch gears to, well, I could have probably started with this, which is disclosing vaccine status. Do you have to? So in Ontario, we have a piece of legislation called the Occupational Health and Safety Act that actually says you don't have to disclose your COVID status. Or not your COVID status, sorry, your vaccine status, whether you've been vaccinated. We don't have legislation like that in other provinces, certainly not in Ontario or BC where we operate. In Ontario, legislation says you don't have to tell your employer if you've been vaccinated or not. But at the end of the day, forget about that. So what? The real question is what happens if you don't disclose? And what's probably going to happen if you don't disclose is your employer is going to assume you're not vaccinated and then either suspend you or let you go. So same thing happens as before. You have to decide, am I willing to lose my job? If you are, you'd rather lose your job, it's your decision. You were going to be let go and can get your severance. So again, it's not about whether or not your employer is allowed to demand to know. It's about what happens if you don't comply. If you don't comply, you will lose your job as a practical matter. That is, I can almost guarantee you that. Okay, but yes, you will be owed compensation, and certainly in Ontario, potentially other damages beyond just your severance. Okay, so keep in mind, not about whether they're allowed, it's about what happens if they do it anyway. Now, I want to talk a bit about some strategies. A lot of you may say, well, I don't want to lose my job, right? I don't want to lose my job. So let's talk about how you keep your job or increase the chances of keeping your job, because there's no way to make your employer keep your job, but how to increase the chances. And in doing that, we'll talk about some human rights exemptions. So probably the easiest or not the easiest, the most effective, it's not the easiest, the most effective way to increase the chances of keeping your job is if you have a doctor's note saying that you cannot be vaccinated for health reasons. Now, I understand that a lot of doctors are not providing these notes. They don't feel that there's a reason not to be vaccinated. I'm not a doctor, right? So I'm not giving medical advice. But if your doctor feels that for medical reasons in your specific situation, you should not be vaccinated, and your employer, and you get your employer that note, most employers are going to back off. They're going to back off because it's going to be a pretty serious human rights violation to impose or to still fire someone when they have a medical condition that prevents them from getting vaccinated. So that's a very effective way if your doctor agrees and feels that in your specific medical situation, that's fine, that's allowed, or that's required. So that's number one. Another option is with respect to a religious exemption. Those are very difficult and unlikely to be successful. A lot of the major religions have publicly, I'm talking about leaders within those religions, have said, no, we don't feel that the religion mandates that you don't get a vaccine. So how do you get a religious exemption? The best advice is to get a note from a religious leader in your religious community, a priest, a minister, a rabbi, whoever the right person is in your religious community, and have them say that, number one, that is a aspect or a belief of the religion, and that you have that genuine belief. If you can get that letter from a religious leader, then the chances of getting the employer to back off are very good. If you simply send your employer a note saying, because of my religious beliefs, I can't get vaccinated, that's not going to do anything. It's not going to be effective. Keep in mind, you're going to get severance if you're let go, potentially other damages too, but you're not going to keep your job. So with respect to religious exemption, you need to speak to, again, the religious leader in your community. If they're not going to provide you with that note, you're not likely going to be able to get a religious exemption. So that's with respect to religious exemption. But let's talk about some other ways. If your employer says you have to get a vaccine or else, why not suggest to them, well, how about instead of a vaccine, I agree to regular COVID tests? So that may be something your employer says, okay, fine, that solves our concern, and instead of vaccines, we'll agree to have you have regular tests. So suggest that as an option. I also want you to send an email to your employer telling them that you are taking COVID-19 seriously, that you are going to be wearing masks and engage in social and physical distancing, that you're going to meet government requirements. You're not just ignoring COVID-19. because it's much easier to let someone go if the employer thinks, well, this person is irresponsible. You want to make sure they understand you're not irresponsible. You may be making a personal choice about vaccines, but you're not ignoring COVID-19 and your other obligations. So that's a very good idea. Now, the other thing is this. A lot of you have told me this has been very stressful for you. And these mandates, these rules, and you can't sleep, you can't eat, and you can't work. So here's something else to consider. Go speak to your doctor. Forget about vaccines. If you feel you have this stress and anxiety, talk to your doctor about it. If your doctor feels that because of this anxiety that you have, you should be off work, then the doctor can give you time off work, and you can essentially remove yourself from the workplace until you feel better, and maybe by then this issue with respect to vaccines is resolved. Now, this works really well if you have a short-term or long-term disability plan in your workplace, because if you are off work, you can apply to short-term disability and get compensated. So again, if you feel, and your doctor agrees, again, I'm not a doctor, I have no idea if your doctor would see it that way, but if your doctor sees, stress, anxiety, working now is not going to be good for you, you need to stay home and not work. If they give you that doctor's note, you can be off work. You won't be fired for that. That's nonsense. No employer is going to do that. And potentially, if there's a long-term or short-term disability plan, you could get paid. So that is another idea in terms of how to deal with a workplace where you're feeling stressed and you want to maintain and keep your job. Now, I know a lot of employees have thought of or looked at or saw these liability forms, and they want to give their employer this liability form. Waste of time and paper. Okay. Don't do that. Too many trees are going to be killed. Not worth it. Doesn't do anything. Has no legal significance. Your employer won't even look at that. Won't even read it. It's going to go straight in the garbage bin. So please, I know you may think that this is some sort of a solution. It's not a solution. It's not going to do anything. I know someone posted it on the internet. Take my word for it. That's all I do for a living. It's not going to be effective. Again, I'm going to continue. My name is Lior Samfiru. For those joining us, we're talking about employment law and your workplace rights during this particular time when we're dealing with mandatory vaccines. Again, to see this presentation later this week, we're going to post it on our website at covidrights.ca. If you've missed part of it, or if you have friends or family that want to see it as well, you can direct them to covidrights.ca. Now, I want to talk a bit about, just very briefly, about Bill S-201 with respect to genetic testing. A lot of people think, well, there's this Bill 201 that prevents them from having me get COVID tests. No. Bill 201, S-201 does not apply here. That bill deals with your genetic information. A COVID test deals with the virus's genetic information. So it's not an answer, it's not a solution, it's not actually relevant. I know there's a lot of misinformation on the internet, but that particular bill is not going to help you, is not going to provide a solution, it's not going to do anything in terms of preventing your employer from doing something. Okay, so debating it, showing it to your employer, threatening your employer with it is not going to be effective here. Now, we talked about severance. We talked about the fact that if you lose your job because you don't get vaccinated, or you lose your job because you didn't have regular COVID tests, then you're going to be owed severance. So the next question always is, well, how much severance am I owed? It's one thing if it's a week, it's a different thing if it's a year, right? So let's talk a bit about how do you find out how much your severance is owed. All right. So first of all, let's talk about some myths. It's a myth, and it's wrong, and it's false that severance is 1 week per year of service. Nonsense. Severance is significantly more, and the main factors that go into calculating your severance are your age, your position, and the length of your employment. So the older you are, the longer you work, and the more senior a position you have, the more severance is owed to you. Now, severance could be up to 24 months pay. Generally speaking, for most jobs, you're not going to get less than 2 or 3 months severance. You're not. And obviously, if you work longer or older or senior position, it's going to be much more. And even if you only work for a company for a few months, you could be owed a few months severance. So don't assume that just because you work for a company for 6 months, well, what's my severance going to be, a week's pay? No, that severance could easily be 3, 4, 5 months pay, even if you only work for a few months with the company. And that's especially true now during the pandemic, where it's probably going to be harder to find another job. So please don't ever assume that. Now, you really want to know, how much am I owed specifically? Well, here's how you can find out right now how much severance you're owed. We created a tool called the Severance Calculator. The Severance Calculator allows you to find out how much severance you're owed in real time. So all you do is you go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. I'll give you that address again, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. When you go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca, you'll see our Severance Calculator tool there. You click on it, and then you answer 3 questions about your age, your position, and the length of your employment, and it's going to give you an estimate right there of how much severance you are owed. By the way, I should be very clear on this. It's free. It's anonymous. You don't have to put in your name, the company's name. You don't have to put in a credit card. No one's going to ever know that you were there. But it's something that you can use to find out, well, if I lose my job because of this vaccine issue, how much severance am I owed? Again, you go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. We just posted that link in the question and answers there, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that your severance includes all components of your compensation: salary, bonus, benefits, pension entitlements, car allowance if you have a car allowance. It includes all components of your compensation. Okay, so pocketemploymentlawyer.ca is a very good place to start. Now, if you want to, you can also contact me directly from pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. There's a button there at the end. You can press to contact me directly. You don't have to use it. It's there for you if you want it. So good idea. And by the way, tell others about it. Even if they're not concerned about vaccines, everyone that has ever lost their job should make it their first priority to go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. The vast majority of people, when they lose their job, they're offered a lot less than what they're owed, pennies on the dollar. Every day I speak with dozens of people that were offered 2 months when it should have been 10 months, or 10 months when it should have been 20 months. So chances are, if you lose your job now or in the future, you're going to be owed a lot more than what you've been offered. All right. So you can contact me, my team, if you want to help you get the severance that you're owed. It's not complicated. And by the way, I know a lot of questions come about, well, okay, fine, Lior, so we're going to talk to you, we're going to work with you to get severance and get other compensation because we lost our job with this vaccine situation. How long is it going to take? Is it going to take forever? Well, obviously every case is different. I can tell you that many cases resolve within a few weeks, and that most cases resolve within 3 months. Now, it could be less, it could be more, but if you're asking me for some kind of general information, most cases in most situations, you're going to be looking at up to 3 months. So it's not instantaneous, but it's also not something that goes on for years. Now, when it comes to severance, now when it comes to employment law, now when you have someone that knows what they're doing. So keep that in mind. Now, the other situation you may find yourself is your employer may not be imposing a vaccine, but there's a third party that says you have to be vaccinated. And I'll give you an example. Let's say your job requires you to work with a certain client on the client's premises. So that client says, well, to work in our premises, to come to our premises, you have to be vaccinated or we're not going to let you in. In that case, it's not your employer saying that, it's that third party. Well, in that situation, if it's a third party, the problem here is your employer's hands are tied. Your employer can't change that. And your employer may say, well, I don't care about this vaccine necessarily, but I can't have you work there. And if I can't have you work there, I don't have another job for you. So in that situation, your employer may be able to let you go without compensation because they actually have no choice. So that's a problem. You know, if you work in a specific facility, so let's say you work for a cleaning company and you have to clean a certain building. The cleaning company may say, we don't care if you're vaccinated, but that building owner may say to come into the building, you have to be vaccinated. In that situation, your employer may be able to let you go without compensation because it's not their rule that they're imposing. Their hands are tied. So that's why we have to understand that there are going to be situations like the one I just gave, where your employer may not have an option. Anytime your employer lets you go because they don't have a choice, they don't have a choice in the matter, someone else made the decision for them, then in those situations, no severance is going to be paid. Now, so let's continue here. A lot of people ask me, okay, well, when should I contact you? I've been getting hundreds and hundreds of calls, emails, but most of the time people ask me exactly the types of questions that we've been dealing with on this session. You know, can my employer do this? Can my employer do that? The reality is that right now, all I can tell you, if you're still working, if you haven't been suspended, all I can tell you is what I've been telling you, that you can't stop your employer from doing something, but they're going to owe you compensation, severance, potentially human rights damages as well, if you lose your job, if you're suspended. So the time where I can get involved, the time that you need me or my team, is if your employment status has changed. If you have been suspended, if you have been put on a leave of absence that's unpaid, if you've lost your job, that's when we can get to work. So I can't really deal or really do anything for you if you're still working, if you're still trying to figure out things with your employer. I gave you some thoughts and tips in terms of how do you maximize the likelihood or increase the likelihood of keeping your job. So we talked about exemptions, medical, religious, etc. But beyond that, it's up to your employer to make a move. Once they make that move, then at that point, the law kicks in and the law says, okay, your employer did something. Now you have rights. Now we can pursue what your entitlements are. So I hope that that is clear. Now, I know I've covered a lot of grounds here. I'm going to be answering questions, some questions now. I've taken, or my team has taken down some notes here for me. So I'm going to try to answer some questions, but hopefully this is clear, and feel free to always follow up with me after the session if something is not clear, something is not covered. So let's just see here. I'm going to go through some questions. Okay. So we talked about Bill S-201, why it doesn't apply, because it's the genetic information of the vaccine, not your genetic information that the test determines. Talked about notice of liability form, that why they don't do anything. So hopefully you understand that now. Let's see. You talked about religious exemptions and how you deal with those. A few people have noted that your employer is putting you on a protected unpaid leave. So it doesn't matter. If in that situation, if your employer puts you on a leave where you don't get paid by your employer, where you're not working, you still have the right to treat that as a constructive dismissal. You still have a right to say, I'm not accepting that. I am going to consider that as a termination of my employment and then get my severance. So any slice. And by the way, you may be surprised about this. Even before this whole vaccine situation, if because of COVID-19, your employer put you on a temporary layoff, or in Ontario, sometimes people call it the infectious disease emergency leave, that also allows you to treat that as a termination of your employment. You don't have to stay on a leave or on a temporary layoff. You can treat that layoff as a termination and get severance if you want to. Let's see. Next question. Remote workers. Do remote workers need to be vaccinated? Let's see. No, so in terms of remote workers, again, it's not whether they need to be vaccinated. It's about what is your employer stipulating? What's the line in the sand that your employer is drawing? If your employer is saying, we don't care, remote or not, you have to get vaccinated, then if you don't, you will lose your job. I agree, it doesn't make any sense, right? Why would they care if you're working remotely? But if your employer, despite that, says you have to, if you don't, you will lose your job. Yes, you will be owed compensation. I've said that clearly. But so the real question is not can they, the question is will they? And I know a lot of employers have said that they're going to do that anyway. Another question that I've got is, what is considered reasonable notice and how does it affect your severance? Great question. So we talked about severance and how to calculate that. So let's say in your situation, you're owed 6 months severance. Well, one of the ways the employer can avoid paying you severance is to give you advance notice of your termination. So if you're owed 6 months severance, one of the things your employer can do is tell you, we're telling you today that 6 months from now, you don't have a job. And if your employer gives you sufficient notice to correspond with your severance, they don't have to pay anything else in most cases. Now, if using my 6-month example, if your employer says, we're going to give you 2 months notice, well, they still have to make up that difference, that 4 months, by way of severance, by way of payment. But if your employer says, okay, you're gone tomorrow, then they have to pay your full severance. If you're gone 3 months from now, that 3 months counts towards your severance. Okay, so that's how a notice works. Can a vaccine status lead to a frustration of contract claim by employer? So a frustration of contract happens when the employer says, it's just impossible to employ you. We have no choice. It's just impossible. For example, a frustration of contract in a different context happens, say you work for a plant and the plant burnt down. There's a big fire, there's no more plant. Well, your employer can't keep you employed because there's no plant for you to go in. That's a frustration of contract. Your employer can let you go without any compensation. Well, how does that apply in vaccines? As I said, if someone else is forcing the employer to impose a vaccine policy, there's a government mandate, or there's a third party that says you can't have your employees here because of vaccine, then yes, your employer can say, well, that's a frustration of contract. I can't have you here. But if your employer says, I've decided it's my decision, you have to be vaccinated, that's never going to be frustration of contract. So everything I said today applies in Ontario, in BC, and in Alberta. Because those are the places that we operate in, I can't advise or kind of say anything beyond that. But in Alberta, in BC, that's where these things apply. Let's just see here. I think I am, all right. So I'm gonna pick up some more questions. Are there legalities? Are the legalities the same for people working for an agency who operate with funding for persons with developmental and disabilities? Yes, the legalities are exactly the same. If you have a job, the legalities are going to be the same. Okay, the first question is always, is there a mandate that applies to you? And let's go over the mandates. In Ontario, okay, I'm going to go Ontario, BC, and Alberta. In Ontario, the only mandates right now apply in healthcare and long-term care, but the mandates are such that if you don't get a vaccine, you have to agree to regular COVID tests. If you don't agree to regular COVID tests, then you can lose your job without compensation. So that's the mandate in Ontario. In BC, we have mandates that also apply in healthcare and long-term care that say that if you're not vaccinated, I think it's by the 26th of October, then you can be put off work. In Alberta, we do not have any mandates right now. Now, the federal government has also created mandates, or said that they haven't yet done it, that apply to people that work for the federal government or that work in transportation, airlines, marine transportation, railway transportation, but they haven't said what the mandate's going to be. Is it going to be vaccines or tests? And what happens if you don't get agree to that? So that's still a big unknown. But those are the only mandates that we currently have by government. So another question, is there anything you can do to help us before it comes to us going on a forced leave of absence? Or can you only help us after? So as I was saying, I can only help you if your employment status changes. If your employment status changes, then I can help you. I can't prevent it from happening. I give you some thoughts and tips as to how you could potentially not lose your job, but I can't help you prevent that. A question, will being terminated from my vaccine status impact my EI eligibility? Your employer, if they let you go because you didn't get the vaccine, will probably give you a record of employment that says you're terminated for cause. EI is going to look at that and is going to say, then you don't get any EI. That's where we're going to also have to fight for your EI. We will get it. Yes, we will get EI, but just like we're going to have to fight for the severance and get you that severance, we would also have to fight for EI. The question is, are banks under a federal mandate? No, they're not. Okay. First of all, there's no federal mandate yet, but the mandate that they announced is not for federally regulated employees, it's for those that work for the federal government. So banks, telecommunications, no, those are not. So if you're working in a situation where the bank that you work for has imposed a mandate, that's the bank doing it. Their hands are not forced in that situation. The government is not making them do it. The bank has decided that they want people vaccinated, which means, again, if you lose your job or if you're suspended in that situation, you're not going to be deprived from severance. You're going to be owed your severance. So that's a very good question. Another question, is the company, if mandating a vaccine without a government mandate, required to acknowledge any responsibility for adverse effects that may result from the vaccine? I get that often. If I get the vaccine and something happens, I get a bad reaction, is my employer liable because they told me I should get it? No. Your employer is not going to be liable in that situation. The vaccine company, the pharmaceutical company may be liable. The government that approved the vaccine may be liable. If there was a big error, your employer is not going to be liable. Okay, and that's why those liability forms are a waste of time. Let's continue here. Can my employer force me to do a different job if I refuse the vaccine or refuse to provide my vaccination status? Well, I mean, it's kind of silly for an employer to do that. You can't do this job if you're not vaccinated, but you can do that job. But apart from silliness, your employer can only change your job if it's not a significant change. So I'll give you an example. If they say instead of operating machine A, you're going to operate machine B, yeah, they can do that. That's not such a significant change. But if they say, well, if you're not going to get vaccinated, you have to work the night shift, or we're going to be demoting you, or you're only going to work part-time instead of full-time. No, they can't do that. That's a significant change, which means it results in a constructive dismissal. So ultimately, if you're facing a significant change to pay, to hours, to shifts, to compensation, to responsibilities, you can choose to treat that as a constructive dismissal. Now, I mentioned, by the way, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. I mentioned that because we have our severance calculator tool there. Another tool that we have on our website is a tool that helps you determine if you've been constructively dismissed. So you just click on that constructive dismissal tool, you answer a few questions, and it's going to tell you, is your situation considered a constructive dismissal or not? So it's not every time your employer does something that's a constructive dismissal, but if they make a significant change to terms of employment, yeah, absolutely, it's constructive dismissal. And by the way, one of the concerns I always have with people accepting a significant change is by accepting a significant change, you give the company the right to do it again. So you really want to be very careful with that. Let's see, I'm going to continue answering some questions. I work for a major telecommunications company in Alberta. They're requiring all employees be vaccinated by November 15th. My company is federally regulated. Can they make me get the COVID shot? Again, it's exactly as we've been saying. It's not about can they. It's a question of what happens if you don't. So if your employer says, we're going to make you get the COVID shot, and if you don't, we're going to let you go, they're going to let you go. You're going to be owed severance. There is no government mandate that applies there, but you will lose your job. So don't think about, are they allowed? Forget about that. It's not about are they allowed. It's about what happens if they do. If they do, severance is owed, potentially other damages too. But you can't stop that. So you have to be prepared, if you're going to refuse to comply, to lose your job. Let's see, continuing. My employer contacted a lawyer and they assured them that they could do a leave of absence and put those employees on a government subsidy program of sorts. Well, they got bad advice, very, very bad advice. Not the case at all. someone's asking about Life Lab, saying that they have not given the option to take COVID tests. Again, ultimately, if you lose your job because of that, you're going to be owed severance, certainly, potentially other damages as well. So what is the success rate if we do get fired for not getting vaxxed in terms of severance and human rights damages? So the human rights damages is certainly more tricky because it's brand new. I feel reasonably good about that, but I cannot make any guarantees. The severance certainly is much more straightforward. Okay, you lose your job, you're going to get severance. So it's not, now your employer may fight it, but the good news is we know how to deal with that. That's what we do for a living. We call ourselves employment lawyers. Really, we're kind of severance lawyers. That's what we do. Again, my name is Lior Samfiru. I'm answering your questions right now. I kind of finished the presentation portion of my session. Now I'm taking some questions here. So what about a group lawsuit or a class action against my employer if there's a bunch of employees? I am not a fan at all in this case of class actions. Why? Class actions take forever. They'll take some years to resolve or be heard. And by then, we won't even know what COVID is, hopefully. So it makes no sense to proceed as a class action. Even if you have 10 employees, it makes sense to have 10 different cases because they each can be resolved very quickly. So forget about class actions. In this context, I don't think it's a good idea because you want to try to get this resolved now. You want to get compensated not years from now. How are you going to live until then? You want to get compensated now, within a few weeks if possible, right? So class actions don't make any sense here. So next question that I'm going to take to confirm, a constructive dismissal can only result in human rights damages if it was due to refusal to vaccinate, not due to refusal to test after getting an exemption. Yeah, so the only way a dismissal, regular dismissal or constructive dismissal would be a human rights violation is if your employer lets you go because you didn't get the vaccine. Okay, it would not be if you refuse to get a COVID test. Various reasons for that, which are technical, I'm not going to get into, but that's absolutely correct. So, yeah, in terms of cost of testing, yes, definitely. If there's a mandate for testing, then yeah, your employer should absolutely cover the cost. And if they won't cover it, then and you are let go because you didn't take the test, then that's also going to be a wrongful dismissal. Absolutely. Your employer should cover the cost of tests. If you're not sure, if you want to discuss it more, always reach out to me afterwards. Next question, how do you respond to your employer when they say it is mandatory by a certain date, which is less than 2 months, and there is no mention of COVID test as an option? So first of all, if you know you're not going to be vaccinated, you may as well tell your employer, I'm not going to be vaccinated. It doesn't matter, it's 2 months, 1 week. If you're going to be vaccinated, but they just didn't give you enough time to vaccinate to get the 2 shots, then tell your employer, I booked my first shot for this date and my second shot for that date. Most employers are going to back off because they understand, we don't have time machines, we can't do anything about it. But in terms of what you tell your employer, if you're not going to be vaccinated, if you're not going to vaccinate, you may as well tell them, because if you don't tell them that you have, they're going to assume you haven't. So you may as well just tell them that you haven't. You will lose your job. Let's be very clear if that's the line that your employer has drawn in the sand. Next question. I already have had COVID-19 and I have immunity. What should I do because I don't want to take the vaccine and I don't need it? Again, same thing applies. It's not a question of should you get the vaccine. It's not a question of whether your employer should be demanding that you get it. It's a question of what happens if you refuse. So if you tell your employer, listen, I don't need to get the shot. I already had COVID. I have immunity. Your employer may say, cool, that's good enough for us. But if your employer says, I don't care, you have to get the vaccine or you're not working here, then you're going to lose your job. That's just a practical reality. Yes, you're going to be owed severance. Yes, potentially you're going to be owed human rights damages as well, but you will lose your job. Okay, I think it's a very good idea to tell your employer you've had it, maybe even get a doctor's note saying that you've had it so that they know. But if that's not good enough for your employer, you will lose your job. Not because it's legal, because there's just no way to stop it. Another question, where does the myth of 1 week severance per year of employment come from? So that myth is the fact that 1 week per year is your minimum entitlements. And your minimum entitlements are not relevant unless you sign an employment agreement that limits you to the minimum. Every employee has greater entitlements under the common law. And it's just the way that it is. And your employer already knows that. Okay. They may hope you don't know that, but your employer knows that. Okay. So it's wrong. It's nonsense. It's not a week per year of service. In fact, again, forget about a week per year of service. Sometimes the amount of severance can exceed the length of employment. You could have worked for a company for 3 months and be owed 4 months severance. Absolutely, it happens all the time. So it's not a week per year, not even close. Let's see, I'm going to continue answering some questions. My company is American-based and sent out a policy that does not cover Canadian law, and all the medical exemptions says it is for US employees. What do I do? Well, talk to HR and see how do I deal with this as a Canadian employee, or talk to whoever the right person is in your organization. But ultimately, again, we have to go back to the rule, which is the only exemptions you can get is a medical exemption to get a doctor's note. A religious exemption may be very difficult if you get a note from a religious leader in your community. And beyond that, if they let you go, you can't prevent that. It's a question of severance. And yeah, American company will have to comply with our severance laws and our human rights laws. Doesn't matter if they're US based. Let's see. By the way, I know that some people are asking about Human Rights Commission in BC and Ontario. Keep in mind, the Human Rights Commission doesn't decide human rights cases. They're a policy body. The Human Rights Tribunal decides cases. So it's irrelevant what the Human Rights Commission says. And ultimately, neither of them, neither the Ontario or the BC Human Rights Commission have considered this issue of perceived disability. So I wouldn't, that to me is meaningless. Okay, good question here. Is there any recourse for those who have been fired without, for those who have a without cause termination clause in their employment contracts? If we're let go, are there any compensation that's available to us? So here's what this means. Some of you may have signed employment agreements or job offer letters, contracts of employment that try to limit your termination entitlements. And if that clause is enforceable, you may be owed a lot less than your full entitlements. Now, the good news is that in the majority of cases, those clauses in the employment agreement are not enforceable for various reasons that I'm not going to get into. In some cases, they may be. Most cases, they're not. So what do? You send me a copy of that termination clause, and I can tell you if it's enforceable or not. All right? So that you know what you would be owed if you lose your job. So that's a very good point and certainly something to consider. Let's see. What options do I have if I want to keep my job, but I want to wait for other vaccines to become available next year? My employer's policy is full vaccination as of November 1. There's no options unless you can convince your employer to wait, or you can agree with your employer to put you on a leave of absence, but then you're not going to get paid until next year. Ultimately, as I said, it's not about what's right, what's logical. It's not about what should or could happen. It's about what will happen. And if your employer says, I don't care, you're gone unless you're vaccinated by November 1st, you will be gone unless you're vaccinated by November 1st. Now, I don't think a lot of employers realize the amount of severance that they're going to have to pay. They let go 10 employees, they could owe each of them tens of thousands of dollars. So, but you can't really prevent that. I'm going to take one more question here. Can my employer terminate me while I'm on a stress or medical leave due to my refusal to vaccinate or disclose my vaccination status? So if you're on a stress or medical leave, you're likely not going to be terminated. But keep in mind, you don't have to and you shouldn't tell your employer why you're on a stress leave. Okay? You don't even need to say that it's a stress leave. All you have to tell your employer with a note from your doctor is that you can't work for medical reasons. It doesn't matter if it's because you have a bad back or because you're suffering from anxiety and depression. Does not matter. Your employer doesn't have a right to know your medical diagnosis. They just have a right to know, can you work or can you not? So if you're going to be off work, get a doctor's note saying you can't work for medical reasons. As I said earlier, that could be a solution that gets you out of the workplace. Your employer is not likely going to let you go if you're off on a medical leave. They'd be crazy to do that. So because of that, I think that that's a very viable option. Now, with all that said, guys, I know there's more questions. I hope I've answered as many of them as possible. If you need to go back and rewatch this, we're going to repost this later this week on covidrights.ca. Again, covidrights.ca. Remember what we talked about today. Think in terms of what is going to happen if you don't comply, not whether they're allowed to do that. Forget about allowed. It's not about whether your employer is allowed. It's about what happens to you, what your rights are if you don't comply. Feel free to reach out to me and my team, covidrights.ca, employmentlawyer.ca. My name is Lior Samfiru. Thank you very much for joining me today. We'll probably do another session like that again. For now, you can get questions answered also through covidrights.ca. You can connect with my lawyers there, ask a question, they'll respond. So we got your back when it comes to knowing your legal rights. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.